I've talked before on this channel about how studying history is a really powerful thing to do if you're a science fiction and fantasy author, because it teaches you not just what has happened, but what kind of perspective to have on it, what kind of insight can be drawn from it. And this past week, I've been reading a work of history that is a really good example of this sort of thing. It's Ian Kershaw's To Hell and Back. It's actually part of a series. It's a little bit of a reflection on the cover there, sorry. It's actually part of a series that Penguin put out about European history from antiquity all the way to the present age. And this covers Europe, as you can see from the title, 1914 through 1945. So basically both world wars and the interstice between them. Now, if you don't know anything about World War I, or if you only know a little bit about World War II, because who doesn't know about World War II, this book is a really good overview of the basic facts. There's chapters that are basically a timeline layout of what happened and when, and those are interleaved with discussions about what it meant and what kind of analyses could be drawn from it. And one of the first things that Kershaw does early in the book is he tries to set forth a basic overarching thesis about why the wars took place. He says, the chapters that follow explore the reasons for this immeasurable catastrophe, the Second World War and the First World War both. He said they locate these in four interlocking major elements of comprehensive crisis unique to these decades: an explosion of ethnic racist nationalism, bitter and irreconcilable demands for territorial revisionism, acute class conflict now given concrete focus through the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and a protracted crisis of capitalism, which many observers thought was terminal. And what chills me a little bit when I read those words is how we are living through probably anywhere from 2.5 to 3.5 of those things right now. So a big part of my motive for reading this was not just to inform future work of my own, but also to have some perspective about what's happening right now. So back to the book itself, as you can see, I've taken a great many notes throughout. And each one of the flags that I've shown you there has some particular tidbit attached to it that I think is particularly insightful, not just for what it means in the context of the world wars, but as something that can be taken in a larger sense. So one of the things that I flagged earlier was the discussion of nationalism. And Kershaw writes, nationalism was increasingly defining the nation not by territory, but by ethnicity, by those who should be permitted to belong to it. So one of the things that was changing during this period of time was the concept of what constituted a nation or a nationality, and how the direction of that change, again, further forced the hand of violence. Another thing that Kershaw underlines is how each of the major countries that was involved in the conflicts were transformed, and how countries that were formerly democratic fell to autarky or to totalitarianism. And so he writes, the vast array of diverse experiences at home and at the front defy easy summary or generalization. What seems clear, however, and of historical significance, is that the countries which began the war with political systems enjoying a good deal of support, resting on relatively high levels of representation and widely accepted established values, what could otherwise be termed legitimacy, had a distinct advantage in sustaining morale at home and at front, and therefore maximizing the war effort. Of course, this was not enough in itself. So one of the points that he makes is that in all of the nations where there was a strong sense within the people that the leadership that they had could guide them through the conflicts of the future, whether they were economic or political, whether they were warfare or whether they were about depression, those nations stood the best chance of weathering the storm more or less intact. Great Britain, for example, was probably top of that list. France was below that, and down at the bottom you have Russia and Germany. Another useful point he makes is why some countries were that much more susceptible to fascism and others less so. For instance, Germany found itself to be much more hospitable to fascist thinking than Italy did, even though Italy was basically the originator of the term fascism. But it caught on there to a very different degree than it did in Germany. So I think that's one of the most valuable things about this book, is that it gives you a really good sense of the different flavors of all the different sides of the conflict. Why were these countries involved? Why they were at war with each other? What they expected to get out of it? And what it ultimately meant for them. And there is also some discussion of the countries that were not directly involved in the war, but were nevertheless affected by it. Spain, for instance, which remained neutral, but became a dictatorship and remained that way for decades under Franco. So if you've got a story where you're thinking about a big overarching conflict between many different nations or many different forces, You can look to a study of the world wars like this as a good place to start to figure out how to individuate the different forces that are at play in your story. You can get a sense of whether or not they are more aligned towards the democratic side of things, or the autarkic side of things, or the full-out fascist and totalitarian side of things. Or maybe you can come up with your own governmental systems that are more closely reflective of the way things work in your world. The point being that the more individuation you can give to them, the more of a sense that you can separate what they want from each other. The more you can give a sense that they will be in conflict, and that their conflicts will be irreconcilable, and that you can root those irreconcilable differences in the long-running streams of history where people have always held grudges of one kind or another, or things that are more recent, things that are the product of recent developments, that are the part of the development of nations, struggling towards growth and greater self-sustenance and greater advancement. Now, I mentioned before that I was using this book as a source of inspiration for something that I'm going to be writing in the future. And again, that's a big part of why I have all these notes. And I encourage you to do the same thing if you sit down with a work of history like this. If you already have some general idea of what your world is going to be like and what the conflicts are going to be like, and then you sit down with a work of history and, of course, a pack of note tabs, you can flag as you go things that seem to be aligned with or parallel to or direct inspirations for the things that are going on in your story. And I think one of the other things that's worth keeping conscious of while you're doing this is how your original concepts may be replaced by something different. And that you may be reading history and saying to yourself, wait a minute, if this is the way it's been once upon a time, and perhaps also today, then maybe the way that I am imagining how it should be is not quite aligned with the way history has dictated things would be. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe history is right. Maybe I need to rework my story to be a little bit more in line with what would actually happen in these circumstances, because I now actually have a case study of how something like that did happen. And that, I think, is the harder lesson to learn, is when you read history and realize that your notions about what may have happened were not correct, or were only informed by a small part of the goings-on. And that encourages you to expand your own thinking and in turn create something that's a little bit deeper, a little bit more completely informed by what history has to teach us. And so once again, it's Ian Kershaw's To Hell and Back. And Kershaw has also written the follow-up to this for this series, which involves Europe from 1950 onwards. And I plan on picking that up along with pretty much every other book in the same Penguin series, and I'll have plenty to say about them after I smash through them. But for now, give this a read. See what you think. I think you'll find a lot.